Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire's listener-supported independent media. Please pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. And you can find these links on the website, aroundtheempire.com. Trying to build the YouTube channel out. We can also use more subscribers on YouTube. That'd be really helpful. youtube.com/aroundtheempire. Psychologist and author Dr. Roy Eidelson joins us today to talk about political mind games and the manipulative ploys used by power elite to mislead Americans, to divide us, and to thwart efforts to advance the common good. Dr. Eidelson has been a practicing clinical research and political psychologist for over 30 years, and his work focuses on applying psychological knowledge to issues of social justice and social change. He's the former executive director for the Solomon Asch Center for the Study of Ethnopolitical Conflict at the University of Pennsylvania, and a past president of Psychologists for Social Responsibility. He's also a member of the Coalition for Ethical Psychology, which advocates against complicity and torture, and in favor of restoring psychology's commitment to do-no-harm ethics. Eidelson's been published in many academic journals, and more recently has written for a broader audience in his Psychology Today blog, and in various media outlets like The Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Alternate, and Truth Out. Last year he published a new book, Political Mind Games: How the 1% Manipulate Our Understanding of What's Happening, What's Right, and What's Possible. This interview was recorded on February 7th, 2019. Dr. Eidelson, welcome to Around the Empire, and thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today.
Thanks very much for the opportunity, Joanne.
I came upon your work when I read your recent article titled, "In a World of Corporate-Backed Politicians, Beware the Sounds of Sirens." And then I bought the Kindle version of your book, and I've read probably a little more than half of that.
Thank you.
I cheated and skipped to the end.
No problem.
for this interview. But just so you have an idea of how much of it I read, and the title of the book is Political Mind Games: How the 1% Manipulate Our Understanding of What's Happening, What's Right, and What's Possible. So I've also taken a look at your website, and I saw that you have, an extensive body of work, professional work, advocacy, articles and interviews. And this book is based on, I believe you said, 20 years of research, right?
Depending on how you count it, yes, it goes back quite a ways, and, kind of developed and ended up taking a direction in recent years that I, might not have planned on, and started focusing on most on the propaganda used by the self-interested 1%.
Right. And also I should mention that I noticed you did some short, like, informational videos. And if we have time at the end, I'd like to touch on one of those that particularly struck me. And if we have the time, maybe we can cover that. The one about drumming up wars.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is impressive. And frankly, now that I've seen all this, I think we could probably do at least 3 interviews. But for today, let's just focus on your recent article in your book and the subject of political mind games. And I think an incredibly important topic of the day. And I would say getting more so every day as we deal with perpetual wars and perpetual political campaigns, and in my view, all-out political warfare, where we, like all of us, are caught in the crossfire. It's the way I kind of see it. Now, one of your main arguments that most interested me was that the predatory, what you refer to as a predatory class, or the plutocrats, some segment of the 1%, plutocrats, their main goal is to, quote, undermine the solidarity that's needed to counter their outsized influence and control. I thought that was put very well, concisely. Now, I see this happening in real time, sort of on overdrive.
Mm-hmm.
And you're saying they use psychological persuasion to do this. So could we start out by elaborating on this and on the goals of these mind games before we get into some specific examples?
Sure. From my research and the perspective I share in the book and other places, and as you noted, I want to emphasize that I'm talking about those members of the 1%, and that's kind of an abstract notion. It's those people with extraordinary wealth and power who use that in order to advance their own interests and their own agenda at the expense of the common good. And there are various ways that can be done. We know that the wealthy in this country have tremendous influence over our politicians through donations and in other ways. We know they have tremendous influence over the mainstream media in terms of what issues are covered and how they're covered. And third, and this is my focus as a psychologist, is they have tremendous influence by shaping the way we understand the world we live in. And that's what they do with what I call political mind games. They tap into the key core concerns that govern our lives, and they shape their explanations of how we should understand the world, what we should expect, what we should hope for, in ways that don't serve the common good, don't serve the public interest, but help maintain a situation where in this country inequality is at absurd levels. You know, I was just looking this past week. I was curious. I read about someone who bought, I guess it's the most expensive apartment ever purchased in New York City, and he paid $240 million for this single apartment somewhere in Manhattan. And I was curious, you know, how do we contrast that? And 60,000 people a night are homeless in New York City. So it's striking, it's absurd, it's distressing. How can we live in a country where someone spends that kind of money, and this, you know, is probably, as I recall, his third or fourth apartment, and so many people are homeless or living from paycheck to paycheck? And the answer, I believe, lies in what is unfortunately very effective psychological propaganda.
Right. Now, you did a great job of structuring this. You target, maybe you could break that down for us. You talk about the particular vulnerabilities that they target and the different mind games that they use. And then you also provided, you know, specific examples of those to bolster your argument. So there are a few of them that I found particularly interesting. I'll dig into those a little bit, but maybe I think we have enough time to break this down a little bit to sort of lay it out.
Okay, great. So based on my research, and this is the research that goes back a couple decades almost, I've identified 5 psychological concerns that I think are most influential in how we as individuals or as members of groups make sense of the world around us. And each of them is linked to kind of a basic question that we may ask every day, ask ourselves in one situation or another. So here are the 5. The first one is vulnerability. And the question is, are we safe? And, you know, sometimes they're just passing thoughts, sometimes they're haunting worries, but we wonder regularly if we are safe, if the people we care about are in harm's way, if there's danger on the horizon, and so on. And right or wrong, and we're certainly not always right in those judgments, but those judgments about our vulnerability matter a lot in terms of what actions we take and what policies we support. So if people can manipulate our understanding of whether or not we're safe, they're going to have a lot of influence on us. That's first.
Right. That's the whole security issue. And I mean, like, I'm not a psychologist, but I'm sure it goes down to, some instinctual survival type things.
Right, absolutely. There's nothing that worries us more or alerts us more and engages us more than the idea that we may be facing danger. So if we're told, well, this is a dangerous world, we're doing this to protect you. Just listen to what we say, follow along, and we'll keep you safe. Those can be irresistible messages, especially when we're frightened. It's not the only way that those in power use vulnerability to get their way. Another example, which we can talk about later if there's time, is the mind game that change is dangerous.
Yeah.
And that ends up when we believe it, and we're inclined to because we tend to favor the status quo. We're comfortable with the world the way it is. It feels at least more familiar to us. We can decide or be persuaded that really valuable changes that would improve our own lives, would improve the lives of most Americans, would improve the lives of most people in the world, are somehow too dangerous for us to explore. But all of those are vulnerability issues, and I focus on 4 mind games that emerge from them. But to just summarize the other core concerns, the second one is injustice. And the question we ask are we being treated fairly? And people are very sensitive to either real or perceived instances of mistreatment, whether it's to us or to people we care about. We get angry, we get resentful, and we often have an urge to right those wrongs and bring accountability to whomever we hold responsible. The problem here is we can be misled about where the responsibility lies.
Mm-hmm.
And the 1% are very good at arguing that the injustice is not of their creation, although in tremendous, huge ways, it really is. Or as another example of a mind game, they'll talk about we're fighting injustice. So they will go after issues in a way that hurts the public by claiming that what they're doing is trying to address injustices. A great example of this is efforts at voter suppression, which the GOP has been doing for years and is done on the basis of it is unfair for anyone who isn't entitled to vote, and therefore we are cracking down. And what they're really doing is making it much harder for people who are entitled to vote. It's almost unheard of that people who aren't registered to vote are voting. That's the Brennan Center compared that to the likelihood of getting hit by lightning. Whereas the number of people who struggle to vote because their names are removed from the voter rolls, or polling places are closed down so that the lines are longer, or same-day registration is not made possible, or election day is not a national holiday. All of these issues stand in the way of justice, but the voter suppression that GOP leaders employ, whether at the state or federal level, is defended as we're fighting injustice. We're trying to make the world fairer by making sure that only those who should vote. So that's injustice. That's the second of the 5. The third is distrust. And the basic question here is, who should we trust? Psychologically, we tend to divide the world into those we find trustworthy and those we don't. It seems to be a natural thing to do. But where we draw that line matters a lot. And if we get it right, then we can avoid harm from those who have hostile intentions and want to hurt us. But if we get it wrong, then we are closing off important, valuable opportunities and relationships. And again, the 1%, the self-interested 1% in this country are very good at persuading us or trying to persuade us about who can be trusted and who can't. And
yeah, it's an important tool.
Yeah, it's a tremendous one, and it's what divides Americans so often along lines that really do not matter for the common good. Issues of race, ethnicity, religion, geography, and others. These are schisms or wedges that those who want to maintain their power employ to keep us from building solidarity and kind of building a collective force that includes people of tremendous diversity. What we have going for us is tremendous numbers. What they have going for them is currently tremendous power. So
Right.
they want to break off those numbers into as many small pieces as they can.
Yeah, and the numbers are so huge. It's just amazing that we don't, this is, that this isn't easier.
Yeah, it seems like it should be, and we wish it were. It's not, and it's part. I mean, it's not just the divisions that they create, and they're very good at it. But we see that every day. We see the way immigrants are portrayed. We see the way people of color are portrayed by this administration. All of these, make us less sympathetic and less comfortable joining hands. And when you put on top of that the fact that in this country, such a relatively, compared to other countries, small percentage of the population votes, it makes it that much easier for them. And that's something else we need to try and do something about. And that'll be crucially important in the election ahead. The more people that vote, the better the chances that the interests of Americans at large will be represented in who the winners are.
And really, in the primaries too, are perhaps even more important as to who the final choices end up being. But that's another topic. But still voting. It's still related to voting.
Yeah, no, it's an important topic, and it actually fits really well in the sense that in this country, we've made it, money is such an important factor in whether someone can run for office. And the money that goes into either supporting the right-wing candidate or the non-progressive candidate, or that goes into ads to attack the people that the self-interested 1% don't want to see in office. These are huge sums of money. It's no longer one person, one vote. It's more like, as they say, $1, one vote. And that definitely happens in primaries. And it's not just, it's not just a Republican Party issue. I mean, this extends across the political spectrum, unfortunately.
Yeah, it sure does. We learned that in 2016. But anyway, I don't want to get you off track.
Well, I enjoy the conversation. I don't feel off track.
Okay.
The fourth core psychological concern is what I call superiority. And the question is, are we good enough? And psychologically, we're quick to compare ourselves to other people. And we often do this in either an effort or the hope to kind of demonstrate that we're worthy of respect or even admiration. The problem here is that in an effort to bolster the way we see ourselves, we're sometimes encouraged to perceive others, especially those who are different, in as negative a light as possible. And the way the 1% take advantage of this, well, there are several ways, but one of the key ways is they portray those who are least well off as losers.
Right.
They are losers. And the message is, sure, you feel some compassion toward them, but don't get carried away with that. They are in their situation because of things they have done wrong or things they should have done that they didn't do. They didn't work hard enough. They didn't study hard enough, whatever it may be. And that's not the case. That's not why inequality is astronomical in this country. It's because people in huge numbers are not getting the advantages or the opportunities to succeed. They can't afford to go to college. They can't afford to stay healthy because of, the health insurance industry and coverage of that sort. But if we see those who are worse off as not deserving to be better or to have better circumstances, then we lose some of that compassion. And again, it's another divide where, if the working class, so to speak, and the middle class, they have much more in common than the middle class has with the 1%. But the idea that what the 1% want to do is make many of us feel that we're like them rather than like those who are struggling. And when it's effective, it's yet another one of those divisions that makes collective action difficult.
Right. And they'll promote and push forward someone who, came out of poverty and, rose to the top and was, super successful. And they're saying, well, look, this person did it. So, any of you can do it. But really they are, they're just an extreme minority. There's, it's an extremely unusual situation. It's not the typical situation.
Right. I agree completely. It's one of the problems with anecdotes.
Yeah.
There are going to be those individuals, but we shouldn't be measuring our society on the basis of whether or not it is possible to move from poverty to extraordinary wealth or whatever scale you want to use. It's not whether it's possible, it's whether it's likely to happen, whether there is upward mobility in this country. And there really isn't. If you grow up in poverty, it is really hard to move all that much beyond it, from one generation to the next. And there are just so many ways that inequality is maintained through, a kind of somewhat relevant example, maybe it's a little tangential, is the estate tax, which, basically doesn't exist at this point. And when people, used to be, was or is, would be a tax on the wealth an individual has upon his or her death. And, years ago, the right wing decided to start calling it the death tax,
right,
instead of the estate tax. And this is a mind game. This is designed to make people think, well, that's unfair. Why should you have to pay taxes for dying? And in fact, there are efforts now underway by progressives to bring back the estate tax. And the GOP is going to do everything they can to argue against it, because the estate tax would be one way to reduce inequality. You would not have families transferring wealth from generation to generation, billions of dollars in some cases. That's not going to be used in ways that benefit the common good. I mean, it's really unfortunate. So that's superiority, and the idea that those who are struggling are losers. Related to that, the 1% routinely insists that they've earned their status, earned every penny they made. That's rarely true. The fifth core concern, psychological concern, is helplessness. And the key question is, can we control what happens to us? And why this is so important is that if we feel helpless, that will sink any undertaking we might individually or collectively be considering. If we think what we're doing cannot succeed, we basically, the typical thing is to give up. It makes sense to give up. We become resigned, our motivation is wrecked, and whatever objectives we might have obtained, we'll never realize. So the 1% target that concern, that fifth concern also, in part to try and persuade us both that change is impossible, and relatedly, in terms of helplessness, when necessary, they will say, don't blame us for these problems. There was nothing we could do about it. So that too that's the fifth: vulnerability, injustice, distrust, superiority, and helplessness are the core concerns that the self-interested 1%, the predatory class, manipulate when they send messages out, when they talk, and they have the biggest megaphones, when they explain the world, when they explain why we can't have Medicare for all, when they explain why we have to have a military budget that's bigger than the next 8 countries combined, when they explain why we can't afford to raise the minimum wage, they will tap into, in a deceptive way, one or more of these 5 concerns and spin a story that makes us think, well, gee, I guess the way the world is the way it needs to be.
Yeah, that last one, the helplessness, was particularly interesting to me. I picked out one mind game that you cite, the change is impossible mind game, and you applied it to, as an example, to unfettered globalization. And that was particularly interesting, the way you did that. So with that as an example, can you lay that one out for the audience who haven't read this yet?
Sure.
And I'd like to actually add something to, I think the same is true of automation. I think you can substitute that right in for unfettered globalization, where, it's not
that's
inevitable.
Interesting. Sure.
Yeah.
That's an interesting example.
Yeah.
What I describe as the mind game is change is impossible. The basic claim from the 1% is this is how the world is. It can't be changed. So part of what they do there is they deny responsibility for the world as it is. So it's not their fault that inequality is so extreme. It's not their fault that products are being made overseas and people are in dangerous factories getting pennies an hour, making parts for products we buy here. There's no way to prevent it, is what they will say. That as a result of globalization, now that the world is interconnected, now that we can travel more easily anywhere we want, now that we don't have to travel, now that we have the internet and other forms of communication, there's no getting around the fact that it's a global world and these pressures of globalization are going to exist. And companies are going to look for where they can pay the least in terms of wages. And we can't change it. We should accept it. And of course, again, it's not true. It doesn't have to be that way. There are certain aspects of globalization that, first of all, that are very positive. And certainly we can exert control over what is allowed and what isn't allowed. So doesn't mean there has to be poverty wages because of globalization. It doesn't mean that Americans, for example, here have to lose their jobs or have to get paid less because there are people earning less, much less in China. But it's presented as though we have no choice. And what it really is, instead, we could prioritize other factors as being necessary in order to make certain globalized efforts permissible. We could focus, for example, on living wages as necessary. We could focus on human rights protections so that you don't have child labor, for example. We could focus on the environment, saying that certain certain aspects or means of production that are destructive to the environment are not okay in kind of international trade. These are options available to us. All of them would, at least in the short term, reduce the profits of multinational corporations. And they have tremendous power, as do their CEOs. So that's the globalization part, but maybe say more about automation, which I agree with.
Yeah, I think that that is treated like automation, and you could actually artificial intelligence. You can also add that one in. It's treated as an inevitability, as if technology, even you could say that it's something that's out of our control. We can't help it. Things are just gonna zoom in that direction. When the truth of the matter is, just because you can automate something doesn't mean that you have to or that you should. So it's just these, like this big word globalization. I think that automation and artificial intelligence are just the same. It's our choice. They're tools. They're not inevitabilities. And I just think we need to push back on that. Particularly people in my technology need to push back on that. So I was glad to see that you brought that up, particularly the globalization issue, because just to go back a little bit to one of the things that you said was the main goal of using all of these mind games to begin with. You said it much better than I'm going to be able to say it, but it's to resist the kind of I think you called it a superordinate group, like to prevent all of us from realizing what our common interest is and rising up against this destructive predatory class. And that's the whole reason why they're using these mind games to begin with. And now I've lost my train of thought. I was going to insert that, and now I forgot what I was going to say. I'm famous for that.
That's not a problem. What the self-interested 1% want to do, they have a very good situation right now. Inequality is extreme. They are making fortunes. Their incomes keep going up while those, for most people, are barely moving. And to the extent they are self-interested, and again, not all wealthy people are. Some are, remarkably generous and committed to addressing social and economic inequality. We need more of them. But those who are looking out solely or primarily for themselves have a variety of methods available to them. And some of them you only see in dictatorships. I mean, those kinds of violent crackdowns. But you don't need that in a democracy, or in the United States. A tremendous amount of the control happens almost without our realizing it. It's through the messages we receive. It's through these mind games. It's the way issues are presented to us by tapping into, again, what I consider the 5 concerns that dominate how we make sense of the world. And when the 1% are successful at that, we stop organizing, we stop caring about our neighbors, we stop recognizing who's responsible for what's wrong. And those are all matters that maintain a terribly unjust status quo. And we need to overcome these mind games in order, if we want to change our society, or at least that's a claim I would make for sure, is that to make progress, we have to resist and counter these mind games.
Now, on the messaging issue, the question I had was the media. So that's not the only instrument of messaging, but until recently, it certainly was the main one. And in the 90s, there was a severe concentration of the owners of the media. Now it's a lot. Things have changed quite a lot since then, and we've got a lot more ways to communicate, and we have a lot more channels to watch, if you will, with the rise of alternative independent media like this podcast. Um, but the media themselves, I mean, most of the people who are in the media, they'll come from the middle class. They're not all from this same segment of society. So they didn't start out being like-minded. So do you think that they know that they serve this sort of predator class, or are they victims of the mind games themselves?
Well, that's a great question. I think it's both.
Yeah,
Uh,
probably.
yeah, the question I would raise, I wouldn't be I'm far from the first to raise this, is, or the way I would look at it is, well, what does it take to get ahead in the mainstream media? What does it take to get to the top? And to some extent, you're shaped to take certain paths to move forward professionally. And whether that means being immersed in the mind games of the wealthy and powerful and coming to believe them, or whether it's recognizing that, the best way that this story can go forward is if I frame it this way and not some other way. There are, and I want to emphasize this, there are tremendous journalists and people in the media doing independent work or working for larger media outlets and doing tremendous writing and investigative work. And that's crucially important. The problem is that at the higher level, the people in charge, it's a money-making business. There's no getting around it. And I mean, one of the remarkable things was Les Moonves, who was no longer, he was CEO of CBS. And I think it was sometime in 2016, he was being interviewed maybe at a Morgan Stanley event, but I may not be remembering that correctly.
Probably. That's often the kind of forum where this kind
Well,
of thing,
okay.
these things slip
Yeah.
out, on
And
conference calls or meetings like
right.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was probably, I think it was something like that. And he basically said, that Donald Trump, the message was, yeah, it's a problem. He's a problem, but boy, we love him. Keep doing it, Donald. Because this was back, I guess, during the campaign period when lots of money was being made as a result of Trump being the candidate, money that wouldn't have been made to such an extent if it had been a different person running. And, the CEOs of CBS or Disney or whatever it may be, they care about whether the company is making money or not. And that's it doesn't necessarily affect the integrity of the reporters or the journalists. And that's what I want to emphasize. It affects whether those people are going to succeed professionally, whether the stories are going to get published. And that's tough to get past that hurdle. I mean, again, when we talk about the mainstream media in particular, but yeah, wonderfully, there are any number of non-mainstream outlets, including, progressive outlets where you can at least learn or hear a different perspective on the issues.
Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of those journalists and outlets are going down the tubes on some really important issues like wars, like this whole Russiagate hysteria. So I hope that's a temporary thing. I don't know. What kinds of things do governments and political actors do to set up these psychological mind games or maybe even psyops? Like, is there a cottage industry out there, an infrastructure within governments? I know intelligence agencies are infamous for this, but I have a feeling that it's much more widespread than just intelligence agencies now. Like, who's doing this? Are they hiring experts, people like you? Not you personally, but I mean, we saw that in the torture industry, right? They hired the people who know how to, who understand people's minds and know how to manipulate them.
Well, since you mentioned the torture issue, I've spent a lot of time as a psychologist fighting back against the misuse of psychology and psychologists by the Department of Defense and the CIA, and it's an awful stain on my profession that psychologists were directly involved in the torture of war on terror detainees at CIA black sites, at Guantanamo. And it's not that they necessarily knew what they were doing. In the case of the most high-profile ones, it's not at all clear they did know what they were doing, but they sold themselves well, and they were willing to propose protocols that involved utterly dehumanizing and torturous techniques. That's a kind of separate. That's an issue that I am also deeply involved in, and it's one where the same mind games appear. I mean, the justifications for torture come right from the political mind games, that I've written about, and some of which I've described here. But Joanne, in terms of the bigger question you asked, the promotion of these mind games, I don't think it requires necessarily a secret cabal of any sort. If members of the 1% and those who are extremely powerful and the politicians they have funded, they understand that certain kinds of explanations will help their cause better than others, and they will push those explanations, and there will be think tanks, typically conservative think tanks, that will issue what we're supposed to believe are objective reports supporting what I'll call the 1% view. And certainly, I mean, it's something that is already upon us and will continue. The issue of universal health care and Medicare for all. There's no doubt, since it would eliminate or dramatically reduce the health insurance industry. Well, we know that the health insurance industry is going to do what it can and use its enormous wealth to fight back against Medicare for all. It's not going to do it by saying, we don't want to be out of business. We don't want to lose, the tremendous circumstances we've created for this industry. It's going to be done by claiming that Medicare for all will be dangerous, that it can't work, that change is impossible, or that there will be victims that we don't yet know about who will suffer if we try and switch to Medicare for all. Or they'll say it's un-American, that's socialist. That may be okay somewhere far away, but it's not what the United States is about. These mind games, we'll see them. We're already seeing them. We'll just see them more as Medicare for all efforts move forward. And at the same time, to kind of allude to part of what you may have been referring to, undoubtedly, there's no doubt that there are lobbying firms, that there are polling firms, that there are efforts, that there are focus groups to figure out, well, what's the best way to fight back against Medicare for all or a $15 minimum wage. And they have the money. They'll do the analysis. They'll figure out what claims seem to shake the public most and make them turn away from progressive initiatives. And then once they've settled on that, they have talking points. They're generally very good about staying on point in what they're saying. They have many high-profile individuals who can fill a room for a talk whenever they want. They're guests on TV and on certain channels in particular. They're there pretty much all the time. So I think that's the way it unfolds, if I'm understanding your question.
Yeah, that's good. I would say that it's much more bipartisan now, and this is coming from someone, I mean, just from to make my sort of political stance. I was a Bernie Sanders supporter, for example. I was a lifelong Democrat until I no longer consider myself a Democrat. I think both parties are completely, I don't know what you want to call it. I don't know if they're salvageable. And I think after this 2016 election, I see, especially when I focus on war, just it's not really so much about left and right anymore. It's more about this predatory class versus the rest of us. So, I'm not too confident in the left, or what used to be considered left-wing think tanks like Center for American Progress, things like that anymore. I mean, they're just thoroughly co-opted now by the same, maybe it's a different industry or something, but by the same kinds of forces. But so from a psychological standpoint, you've implied the kinds of things that they have zeroed in on are very hard to resist. But you do, toward the end of the book, talk about the ways that we can deal with these things. First of all, the ways we can protect ourselves from these type of manipulations, and then what we can do to, I don't know if you say, sort of clue other people in on what's going on. And maybe this is a good time to bring up that video that you made. It was from 2007. So you were early on this, and I see a lot of the things in your book, some of these same points. It's clear that you were already onto this, but even back then. And you titled it "Resisting the Drums of War." And I find this video, though it's from 2007, it's just as important and relevant today as it was then. You cite a set of appeals that they make to sell and justify wars, and specific points that we can and should use to counter them. And you say that, quote, "Our core concerns are easy, soft targets for warmongers," and that's a great way to frame it. I should also say that when I read this, I thought, oh, this is why I'm doing this podcast project of mine, because I am trying to do the kind of thing. So you kind of help me understand why I'm doing what I'm doing here. So in one example, you say vulnerability appeals that are deeply flawed and must be corrected. And then some bullet points, you say, in fact, it is the unjustified use of military force that makes us less safe. They're trying to say you're not safe. And these wars make us even less safe. And then you say that it multiplies our enemies, it drains valuable resources, and it unnecessarily places our soldiers in harm's way. And then I think you also point out the helplessness appeals that they use. And then you give us the points to counter those. Again, with bullet points, you say false claims of success and cries of victories at all costs are not evidence of toughness under fire. And then you say that it reflects a refusal to face reality. And then the last one, a very important one, it's a lack of courage to actually admit and correct mistakes. And I think that it was true then, and it's extremely true now. And I would even, just to tie it into the empire, the American empire, it's very clearly in decline. Some people knew all along that this sort of superpower status was not a sustainable thing. And some people are willing to accept that it's just, that actually is an inevitability. But some just are not, because I can think of 100 reasons why they don't want to give up this super status that we have enjoyed over the past, say, 20 years. But anyway, I just wanted to point this out for our audience, that you sort of lay out, this is the way to do it. Identify the points that counter these mind games that they are using to manipulate us. And in this case, it's used over and over again to sell wars.
Yes, Joanne, thank you for finding that video. That's takes me back a bit, but yeah, I was working on these issues back then, and the way these mind games are used to promote war and violence, that hasn't changed. That the territory may change. It may not be Iraq on a particular year or month, but the same strategies, kind of propaganda strategies, are used. And in terms of what you described about the Republican and Democratic Party, I mean, here is, and I think you're suggesting this, a great example. This is bipartisanship at its worst. There's no more bipartisan issue that receives bipartisan support in Congress than our military budget. Everyone, you look at the votes each year for the defense budget, and they're pretty darn close to unanimous, as I recall. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I think our current defense budget is like as large as the next largest 8 countries combined.
It's really more than $1 trillion a year. You have to count more than just that DoD budget. That doesn't include the nukes. It doesn't include the VA and all kinds of other things.
Yeah, and it would be, even if that made us, and this is not the case, so much safer than everyone else in the world. Well, then you could wonder, well, is that right anyway? But it's not true to begin with. The basic beneficiaries of the huge, bloated defense budget are defense contractors. And, it's the Lockheeds, it's the Raytheons, it's Boeing. These companies, they win, they become more profitable when we're at war. Halliburton and so on. I mean, the names are familiar, and they have tremendous influence on our political leaders in both parties. They give money. We have a lot of jobs tied up in defense contracting work, building bombers. These are jobs these are money for jobs that could instead be used for teachers or health professionals or nurses or, whatever it may be. But the defense industry kind of controls this world and influences both parties. I think I recall, reading, and I may have the numbers off by a little bit, or maybe, I'm not guaranteeing the numbers are precise.
Yeah. Okay.
I think there was a point at which it basically cost $1 million per year for each individual soldier in Afghanistan. Now, it's not the soldier that's getting that money.
No, he's
but
not
it's everything that goes into making putting that man or woman there and keeping them there adds up to a tremendous amount and doesn't make us safer. That's.
Yeah. And another example of that bipartisanship on steroids is a vote that they just recently had to rebuke Trump for saying that he was going to withdraw from Syria and Afghanistan. And the Senate put together a bill rebuking that, opposing it, rebuking it. They can't literally stop him. They're not the commander-in-chief. But what they did was, they held this vote, and 68 senators, which is a relevant number if you think about it, 68 senators voted to rebuke the president for wanting to withdraw from these wars. And that just happens to be just enough votes to impeach. And I don't think that's a coincidence.
That's interesting.
Well, just enough plus one.
Right. Yeah, the war making, the war mongering, it's something that we seemingly do better than anyone else, and it's unfortunate that that our society is to such an extent controlled by it. And there are players who win. When people are dying, there are there are companies who are benefiting, and it's a huge thing to tackle. But coming back to the mind games, where what's drummed into our heads is that it's a dangerous world, and therefore these things have to be done. We have to have 800 military bases around the world. We're told, well, we're fighting injustice, whether it's couched as bringing democracy to foreign lands or however it's said, it calls upon our belief in justice and uses it to garner support for these kinds of, this form of military aggression. We're encouraged to distrust those who are different from us. They become convenient enemies.
Right.
In terms of superiority, we regularly hear descriptions of how we're pursuing a higher purpose. That's another one of the mind games that, unlike other countries, what we're doing is driven by morality. When we attack, when we kill, and to just give a helplessness example, they'll say, the 1% will say, we'll all be helpless. The mind game is, we'll all be helpless if we don't do this. And we heard this, back at the time of the Iraq War, the idea, if we don't confront them and fight them over there, they will all come over here and kill us. This kind of, we can't afford to let ourselves be helpless. It can feel overwhelming.
Yeah, I actually fell for that for a little while too. And there was another example of that was, if we don't take care of this now, then, in 10 years, we're just going to end up there and it'll be 10 times worse. And for me, it was like, my kids are, really little right now, but 10, 15 years from now, it's going to be them. So it played on a really weird psychological thing for me for a period of time until I snapped out of it. But yeah, it works.
Yeah, it does. And what we have to do is work hard to resist those appeals, those mind games. And part of that is, an example I use, which I think is helpful, is in psychology, it's called attitude inoculation.
Right.
So, in the public health world, you get a flu shot, for example, in order to help you better fend off the flu virus in your daily life if you get it. So basically, you're infected with a very small dose of the virus so that you build up antibodies and you're able to resist it thereafter. And that's what we need to do with the falsehoods, the mind games from the self-interested 1%. If we have to build up a resistance to them. If we know that they're coming, and we know they are, we hear them every day, and we learn to recognize the mind games and develop counter arguments to them, then in a sense, we develop a psychological immunity. And once we have that, we can then in a sense, become first responders in helping other people fend off these mind games. The challenge in part is that if you actually defeat someone's false belief, if you can show them that something is not true, that we don't have to worry about climate change or that the climate isn't changing, what you're doing inevitably is you're creating a gap, kind of an empty space in that person's mind. You're taking away something they believed. And you can't leave that space unfilled, but what you need to do is replace it with a different belief, one that's essentially a more accurate representation of what's happening or what's right or what's possible. And that isn't always easy to do, but we need to replace the false beliefs with a more accurate understanding of the world. That's how we defeat these mind games. And the other aspect of that is it's easier to explain to someone why something they heard isn't in fact true if we also explain the motivation from those who are espousing that belief, that there is self-interest at play and at the foundation of the effort to tell us, for example, that climate change is not something we have to worry about, that people are motivated. We're hearing that from people who will benefit, the oil and gas industry, if we do little or nothing to address that concern. So if we appreciate the motivation behind these political mind games and we learn to identify them and develop counter arguments, those are crucial steps, I believe, in overcoming them. And if we overcome these mind games, if we kind of come together as a country, as a public, to reject the tales that the 1% tell, we can make real change, real positive change, I believe, and we certainly need it.
Yeah, I thought that the virus metaphor was a good one that you used at the end there, that these mind games and the propaganda are like a virus and you can inoculate yourself. And I think it's particularly good metaphor because I do think that the internet and social media and organizing things like that also overreach by the predator class that allowed us sort of an opportunity to it generated a lot of pushback, and I think the tools were there to fight against this machine, if you will. And I think that in roughly the 2016, whether it was coincidence or not, I'm not quite sure. But let's just take the Bernie Sanders campaign as one example. I think that the whole idea of things being viral started to work for us. And I think that people who are in the business of propaganda were extremely alarmed. I think we have evidence by their actions, extremely alarmed about that, and worked to shut down this. You can see it in alternative media. I'm not sure if you're aware of what's been going on over the past couple of years, but independent YouTube channels are being demonetized. That's a very common weapon that the elite use against the activists who don't have much money or power. Organizations that don't have much money, they'll starve them of funding in every way they can. But they're going to extremes. They're eliminating people from social media, from Twitter, from Facebook, doing like strikes against YouTube channels that then demonetize them and they can't earn any ad revenue, or they're forced to take down videos or something. There's a definite major pushback on people on social media who are considered influencers. And yeah, I mean, there are some other things going on too that I suspect, but I don't have enough evidence to really put it out. But I do think that they're literally trying to stop certain things from going viral if it's not in their own interests. So I really do wonder whether there are even more efforts to prevent any effective voice from, pushing back against the narrative of people who are in power. So that's why I was even more struck by the metaphor that you used of propaganda is like a virus and being able to inoculate yourself against it.
Yeah, I think it works well in terms of explaining what we need to do. And I wasn't familiar with some of the examples you just mentioned, and I'm interested in learning more about them. But undoubtedly, part of what we face is the obstacle of, obstacles put in our place as we try and make changes, and that there's a lot at stake. It's not as though everyone wins if we move in a different direction, if we tackle extreme inequality. Almost everyone wins, but those who don't are the ones who at the moment have, the most power and influence, and they're going to do what they're going to do. I won't get the quote exactly right, but Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. And we just have to be really demanding and really ready to confront what's happening and to avoid the mistake of believing these mind games, which crush solidarity. They crush our belief in ourselves, and we end up in a very bad place. And it's not as though this all started in 2016. These are issues that have been going on for a long time. And from my perspective, better and more accurate to think of Trump as a symptom as opposed to anything else.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
I agree. All right. Well, that seems like a good place to wrap up. I do want to, when we wrap up, you should, if there's anything that we missed or things you want to emphasize, please do that. There are some other things in here. I've got a lot of notes. I don't know. Maybe we can get back together another time. I'll lay out some of the other things I was curious about that maybe we can take off as separate discussions. But I don't want to
do that
any longer. Yeah. Like of some of the ways that the injustice thing, I'm curious about the way that's being twisted, in my view. It's I fear some of the things I see that are being done with it as a woman. Even the sexism thing. I mean, I'm a person who's always been in a male-dominated field, and I'm totally for women's rights and all these things, but I'm kind of very worried about the way I see some things being exploited. I'm curious about that, and also like the mob rule thing that's been going on in a number of different areas. And so I have some other questions for you for another time. But if you would just, wrap up in any way that you would like, and also make sure you let everybody know where to find your work and where to find your book and how to support you.
So again, Joanne, thank you for the opportunity to talk about these ideas. I hope your listeners have found it interesting. If just a small plug, if people are interested in my book, Political Mind Games, they can find it at independent bookstores or online through IndieBook, or I'll say, through Amazon as well. My last name is spelled Eidelson. Would love for anyone who might be interested to follow me on Twitter at Roy Eidelson, RoyEidelson, and my website is royeidelson.com. Glad to have had a chance to talk with you about these issues, and in solidarity we go forward.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it very much, and hope to talk to you again.
Great. Thank you, Joanne.
And that's our show. Thank you for listening. A special thanks to Roy Eidelson. Find his work at royeidelson.com, follow him on Twitter at Roy Eidelson, and find his book at your preferred store. It's called Political Mind Games: How the 1% Manipulate Our Understanding of What's Happening, What's Right, and What's Possible. The Around the Empire podcast is independent media. Your support is really important. Please pitch in, patreon.com/aroundtheempire. You could do one-time donations, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. And you can find all these links on the website, aroundtheempire.com. The syndicated audio podcast is the main focus of Around the Empire. It has been, and that's where most of our traffic is. And we're on podcast apps, most of them iTunes, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, all of those. Please subscribe to us there. If you like us, check some stars for a good review. It helps with ranking and visibility. And I like to do some more content this year, including video content, live streams, little mini docs. So I want to hire some creative freelance people to help out with that. But more importantly, what we need right now is more YouTube subscribers to build out that channel. And you can find the link for our YouTube channel in the show notes. Hit the red subscribe button or just find it on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. Also, the individual videos. Hit the thumbs up icon to like those. That helps us. Follow us on Twitter @AroundTheEmpire. See you next time. Take care, everyone.